Good morning. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the question of capitalism and socialism. As we have been moving deeper into the pandemic, we have seen that it has at least set off an economic crisis. I think a lot of us would argue that at least another business cycle crisis was long overdue, given the internal dynamics of capitalism, but the pandemic has certainly added a new and distinctive dimension to that. And in this context, there are some growing calls that we ask tough questions about our underlying economic structure. And of course, some of this discussion was already taking place in the background in the context of the presidential campaign. So today I would like to talk a little bit about the arguments for and against capitalism. And I'm going to begin by laying out the defense of capitalism that is set forth by Friedrich Hayek, look at some general critiques of that, and then talk about Marx's critique of capitalism. So Hayek was an economist, an Austrian school economist. He is the economist who was in many ways the intellectual author of neoliberalism, of the turn towards a radical free market economics and an abandonment of Keynesianism, beginning around 1978, influencing very profoundly the Thatcher government in England and the Reagan government in the United States. And Hayek works out of what is fundamentally an evolutionary paradigm. He believes that individuals pursue their self-interest, seek to thrive, or at least survive under conditions of scarcity, that in the process they develop certain practices. And these might be technologies, economic structures, languages, social structures, kinship systems, religions, systems of morality. And some of these work and some of them don't. Those that work are conserved in effect by natural selection and become part of a larger tradition. Those that don't work are ultimately discarded. And his argument fundamentally is that capitalism is one of those practices which has proven its survival value, and that socialism has demonstrated that in spite of the fact that he acknowledges it is motivated by some sound moral reasoning, fundamentally doesn't work. And he doesn't just stop there, though. He gives a reason for it. And he argues that market systems are better than central planning mechanisms at accessing and processing information about what people need. So the economy, in effect, from his vantage point, the market system is an information processing system. When we buy something, we register demand. When we produce something and offer it in the marketplace, we register supply. The market aggregates these inputs and pumps out another piece of information, namely the price, which in effect tells us how much of each commodity to produce. And his idea is that this is a ultimately perfectly harmonious equilibrium system that guides us to produce exactly the right amount of exactly the right commodities. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is that the marketplace doesn't necessarily access all kinds of information. It accesses information about what people want to the extent that it is backed by money. And so even before we begin to look at some of the deeper structural questions, we will notice that Hayek's argument for the marketplace does not address the question of higher goods, abstract goods, such as the development of human capacities, broader spiritual concerns, ethical concerns such as equality and community, the integrity of the social fabric, the integrity of the ecosystem. And so, in a very real sense, while Hayek offers a fairly good explanation, I would argue, of some of the challenges faced by historic socialism, he really doesn't show that the marketplace can answer the moral objections to capitalism. Now, Marx operates within the context of a fundamentally different perspective on the world. I know that many of you, to the extent that you have heard of Marx or studied Marx at all, have done so in the context of a set of anti-communist assumptions that were inherited from the Cold War. And you know Marx as a vicious critic of religion, an enemy of God, and all such things. But that's not really accurate. And in fact, that view undercuts any real effort to understand his contributions. In many ways, Marx was very much rooted in an ancient philosophical tradition, a tradition that goes back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And that tradition understands everything in the universe as a participation in being, as a participation in the capacity to create. And everything participates in being to the extent of its nature and ability. So minerals retain their form, plants engage in nutrition, growth, and reproduction, animals in sensation and locomotion. Human beings add the element of reason. And using reason, we are able then to arrive at higher goods. We don't just want to mate, we want to have an enduring life partnership with someone. We don't just want to eat ourselves, but we want to ensure that the entire human community is nurtured and fed and housed and clothed. And all of this in the older tradition, in the tradition of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the Jewish and Muslim commentators on them, such as Moshe ben Maimon, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and the great Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas. For all of those folks, this pointed towards the reality of being as such, which was the philosophical concept which in their mind best captured the concept of God. Now, where Marx differs from this is simply in his deep and profound belief that creative capacity is not pre-existing, but rather an emergent property of the universe. So as the universe evolves and develops and grows, as we move from a purely physical universe to a biological universe to a social universe, there is this emergent capacity for creativity. And it is that capacity become conscious of itself that for Marx defines human nature and defines human values. So what then fundamentally is his problem with capitalism? Marx argues, in fact, that capitalism is one of a long series of economic structures that we've developed to centralize and organize resources for production. And it is by no means, in his mind, sorry about that. It is by no means, in his mind, the worst economic system. Rather, for Marx, economic systems are appropriate to certain levels of technological development. The problem for Marx fundamentally with capitalism is, first of all, it is based on a system in which the vast majority of people are forced to sell their labor power in order to survive. And in doing that, he argues, we become alienated from ourselves. We become alienated from our underlying creative capacity. In effect, our creative capacity belongs to someone else. We may not be chattel slaves. We may not be in a situation where everybody and everything that we know and do and love belongs to somebody else, but the vast majority of our time and effectively all of our creativity does. And for Marx, that fundamentally deforms us as human beings. We begin to see our creative capacity simply as a means to consumption rather than as an end in itself. And it undercuts, therefore, the emergence of that creative capacity in the universe. Second, for Marx, while there was a time when capitalism may have been technologically progressive, that time is long since past. Marx argues that there are fundamental contradictions in capitalism itself, which lead to increasingly severe economic crises. And he identifies two of these. The first is basically an underconsumption crisis, because individual capitalists are incentivized to pay their workers as little as possible. They make more money if they pay their workers less. There's a tendency for the rate of wages to decline. That's reinforced by the process of technological development, which drives down the value of labor power. But of course, if wages are too low, people won't be able to buy the products that they're producing. And that sets in motion an economic crisis. Now, that can be ameliorated in various ways, but each of those ameliorations in and of themselves generate their own new contradictions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The second contradiction is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall under capitalism as the economy becomes more technologically developed. This may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but if you think about it, imagine what you need in order to make a business work. You need raw materials, tools, and labor. And it is the labor setting the raw materials and tools into motion which creates the surplus value. The bigger the proportion of your resources, of your capital that are going into tools, into technology, okay, the lower the rate of profit generated. Now, again, there are things that can mitigate against that. If you come up with a really unique new product and you have a monopoly on it, you can gather what Marx calls rents, basically, because you're the only person who can produce something that everybody wants, and they will pay a great deal more than its actual value. But in the long run, those monopolies disappear. It only takes an engineer and two lawyers to go from the early Apples to PCs, and then to PC clones, and then to the very wide range of different personal computer options that we have today. So in the long run, Marx argues, capitalism stops being technologically progressive. Now, again, there are various and sundry ways to ameliorate these problems. You can generate super profits by exporting capital to low-wage, low-skill activities, generally speaking, in other countries. Rather than building a steel mill, you can buy a banana plantation. But globally, in the long run, that tends to increase the underconsumption tendency. You can engage in redistributional dynamics. You can do something like the New Deal or the Great Society with unemployment insurance, and Social Security, and Medicare and Medicaid, public works programs, all of those things. And that will help with the underlying underconsumption tendency. But in the long run, it tends to drive up interest rates, and therefore to make capital formation much more difficult. So Marx's expectation is that in the long run, capitalism ends in crisis. Now, you might be asking at this point, what do we do? Because the experience of historic socialism has in many ways been less than dramatically successful. And I do think that that is a fundamental question that anyone who argues for the continued relevance of Marxist critique today needs to answer. And I would argue actually that Hayek helps us to understand some of those problems precisely by pointing out that the whole idea of a centrally planned economy, an economy in which a relatively small group of people, even if they were democratically elected, even if they were not engaged in authoritarian and repressive practices, simply can't access and process the information necessary to run a complex economy, with the result that socialist economies tend towards forced simplification, which in many ways then undermines human development in its own way and for its own reason. Would further suggest that historic socialism does not address Marx's first critique of capitalism, and that is the wage relation. Rather than creating a society in which ordinary people do not need to sell their labor power in order to survive, historic socialism has in effect created societies in which everybody is reduced to a proletarian status. Okay? And that was not at all Marx's aim. So those remain in many ways unsolved problems, but I don't think that means they are insoluble problems. My own suggestion is that rather than focusing primarily on eliminating private property in the means of production, that we focus on making it less and less necessary in order for people, less and less necessary for people to sell their labor power in order to survive. And that's why proposals like a universal basic income are very attractive. In effect, they mean that the pressure to sell your labor power in order to survive is enormously reduced. That increases the bargaining power of the working classes so that their conditions of work become less onerous. That could be coupled by a movement towards a much shorter work week. And as we've seen during the course of this pandemic, a great deal of work can be done under much more flexible circumstances. So many of the accommodations that people have been demanding for a long time, whether people who are disabled or people who need to be home in order to care for children, or simply people who want a more flexible schedule, we can see that a great deal can be accomplished in telework settings and other settings like that. Now, this doesn't take us all the way past capitalism, and Marx was always very clear that our approach should be always to understand the contradictions of the current situation, the contradictions of the current system, and in a sense to act in such a way as to resolve those contradictions in the best way we can at this point. He was not a utopian. And so I think that that suggests some possible roads forward. This has been a longer video than I usually like to make, so I think I'm going to conclude now, but hopefully it'll be a catalyst for your thoughts and reflections. Thank you very much.